C.S. Lewis was an endlessly imaginative and provocative thinker. He was also a thinker who often produced, I think, somewhat half-baked ideas and could be somewhat sloppy in his execution. Certainly, maybe give him a little bit of slack. He was not an analytic philosopher. He had a literary background. So he would throw out ideas that were, again, provocative, imaginative, interesting, could be powerful heuristics, offer new ways of thinking about issues. And yet often the closer you look, the more the problems with the ideas emerge. And I think that that's a fair way to describe Lewis's treatment of the problem of hell in chapter 8 of The Problem of Pain. Let me first of all just say that this is a great book, although I think it's a lot more difficult for the layperson than one might initially think. I did a book study of this at my church a few months ago, and people found several of the passages to be quite difficult, and I agree with them. I think that often the way that Lewis writes, the kind of ideas he plays with, the way he articulates himself is not altogether eminently accessible for the average lay reader today, which is kind of interesting because people tend to think about Lewis as the consummate popularizer. And certainly many of the snippets that often get quoted are, but there are also significant aspects of his writing that are quite complex and I think sometimes a little bit half-baked. In this chapter on hell and the problem of pain, what I see Lewis doing is trying to maintain a view of hell in terms of eternal conscious torment, but he's wrestling with the profound ethical issues that I think are presented by the notion of God resurrecting people to an eternity of punishment in which he tortures them forever maximally in the pains of sense or bodily suffering, as well as the pains of loss or psychological suffering. It seems to me that Lewis is understandably, and as I think he rightly should, he's wrestling with the ethics of this theological vision of eternal conscious torment, and yet he doesn't seem ready to abandon eternal conscious torment, and so he's trying to modify the thesis, at least in a couple significant ways. So the first way that I think that I want to talk about comes near the end of the chapter, where Lewis says we should think about the suffering of hell as internally imposed by the individual rather than externally by God. He says on page 127, I willingly believe that the damned are, in one sense, successful rebels to the end, that the doors of hell are locked on the inside. And he concludes the chapter on the next page by writing, in the long run, the answer to all those who object to the doctrine of hell is itself a question. What are we asking, or what are you asking God to do? To wipe out their past sins and at all costs to give them a fresh start, smoothing every difficulty and offering every miraculous help? But he has done so on Calvary. To forgive them, they will not be forgiven. To leave them alone, alas, I'm afraid that is what he does. So Lewis's view here is that the eternal perpetual suffering of people in alienation and hell is not as bad as it would otherwise be, because God is not actively torturing anybody. Rather, the torture, the suffering that people experience is self-imposed. The doors of hell are locked on the inside. People have alienated themselves, and the suffering that they experience is self-imposed suffering. Now, I agree, at the very least, at first blush, that's a far more palatable image than the image of God actively torturing people, subjecting them to an eternal punishment, which is God's infliction of torture upon them. However, I think that this view actually, upon closer examination, has many more problems than you might otherwise think. Here's the key issue with this idea of self-imposed eternal suffering, exile. It is still eternal punishment. Matthew 25, 41, and 46. So it is still that God is appropriating the self-imposed suffering of individuals as his punishment of those individuals. So you still have the problem that God is torturing people as punishment, although in this case, the torture is self-inflicted torture. People torture themselves, and God then appropriates their torture, their own self-imposed suffering, as his mode of punishment. It's an eternal punishment. To think of another passage, Revelation 14, 9-11. The smoke of their torment rises forever and ever. If we now envision this as the smoke of their self-imposed suffering, they're throwing themselves into the fire. The point here is that their throwing themselves into the literal or proverbial fire is now used by God as the mode of torturing them for eternity. And honestly, that does not seem to me to be a substantial improvement upon the what seems to me this clearer scriptural view, at least for an eternal conscious torment approach, that it is at least primarily divinely inflicted rather than purely self-inflicted. Now we're going to turn back a couple pages earlier to page 125, and we come to the even more, I think, perplexing view of Lewis. He says, if soul can be destroyed, must there not be a state of having been a human soul? And is not that perhaps the state which is equally well described as torment, destruction, and privation? You will remember that in the parable, the saved go to a place prepared for them, while the damned go to a place never meant for men at all. To enter heaven is to become more human than you have succeeded in being in earth. To enter hell is to be banished from humanity. What is cast or casts itself into hell is not a man, it is remains. Here, Lewis is, first of all, he's trying to, in a sense, have his metaphysical posthumous punishment cake and eat it too, by saying we can characterize the state of these individuals in eternity in punishment in hell, both as privation or absence of being, and also as torment, as their ongoing suffering. So it's not literally just privation in terms of the annihilationist conditional mortality view, that they are resurrected to a judgment that results in the cessation of their existence. Rather, it is a view that they continue to exist and suffer forever, but it is a suffering born of privation, of the absence or removal of something. What is the thing that Lewis here proposes that is removed? The thing that he proposes that is removed is humanity itself. These individuals are banished from humanity, as he puts it. When they enter hell, they cease to be human, but they continue to exist. I guess psychologically, this is meant to, again, ease the emotional impact of the doctrine of hell, of people being subjected to eternal conscious torment, because you're saying, well, it's not people that are being subjected to that torment, self-imposed though it may be. It is rather some other creature that this individual now is, which is being subjected to that torment. I should just say, before I criticize it, that view is also endorsed somewhat by N.T. Wright in his book, Surprised by Hope. So while I don't know that Lewis's views about the privation humanity view of hell have gained wide purchase, nothing, I think, like the impact of his other view that hell is self-imposed. I don't think it's had the same impact, but it has gotten traction with people like N.T. Wright. But I find it to be, again, a deeply problematic view. The closer you get to it, the more flaws you see. Frankly, I think both of these views, where Lewis is trying to digest or baptize or revitalize eternal conscious torment, are just like a very bad paint job. You know, from a distance, it looks like the car has a nice new paint job, but the closer up you go, you're like, this does not work. So what are the problems with this privation view of humanity? That the individual that goes into hell is, quote unquote, remains, because it is the banishment of humanity. So you leave behind your humanness when you enter hell. Well, you have two different possibilities here. One possibility is that these individuals who end up in hell are only contingently human. So for something to be contingent rather than essential means that you can give up that thing and still exist. So for example, the length of hair you have, or whether you have hair in your head, is something contingent. You can give it up, you could shave off your hair, and you could still exist. But having your head attached to your body is, I think, essential for being a living human organism, because if your head is removed, you will die. You will no longer exist. And so having a head attached to a body is essential, but having your hair attached to your head is contingent. It would seem, I think, natural to think that human beings are essentially human things. So the nature that we exhibit, a human nature, is something essential, that you cannot continue to exist unless you exist in virtue of having a human nature that is exemplified. You are human. Lewis's view entails that at least the reprobate or the lost, those who end up in hell, are not essentially human, but rather contingently human. that their human nature is exemplified contingently like hair growing on your head rather than essentially like a head attached to your shoulders. Lewis may also be taking the view, the more general view, that anybody who, or that human beings generally exemplify human nature contingently. And of these two views, I suspect he would be committed to the second one, because the first view would really entail that God kind of set it up from the beginning that some people will contingently only be human, and those people will all end up in hell, which would really be a kind of predestinarian Calvinist view that I think would be very alien to Lewis's Arminian and inclusivist and encompassing ethos. So I think he would be committed to the latter view, which says that all human beings are contingently human, that we exemplify human nature contingently, but we can cease to exemplify it, which is what happens in hell. Just like you could cease to have hair on your head, which happens when you shave it or when you lose it from growing old or from a medical treatment or something else. And I think that that's just a kind of crazy view, the idea that we are contingently human. I don't think that it is a view that one should endorse. Certainly not if this is the only reason that you would endorse it. I mean, what other reason is there to believe that human beings are only contingently rather than essentially human? I don't see any good independent grounds to believe that. So then we would be left with, well, the one ground that you would believe it is that somehow it emotionally makes it easier to imagine hell. But I don't know how that is an improvement. Let's say that Jones is a Christian and his daughter apostatizes and leaves Christianity, and Jones and his daughter both die. They're both resurrected. Jones is resurrected into heaven. His daughter is resurrected into hell. And now his daughter ceases to be human, and she is subjected to an eternity of self-imposed agony and torture. But somehow Jones in heaven is supposed to be feel better about all of this because his daughter has now ceased to be human, even though she's still his daughter, right? She's still the child that he gave, that he fathered and that he loved and he reared, and she is now suffering in hell, albeit now no longer human, because to be human is just something we contingently have, like having hair on our head. I don't see how that addresses the problem of hell at all in terms of eternal conscious torment. I think it just gives you this really strange metaphysical thesis about being humans contingently with no real payoff in terms of really ameliorating or addressing in any significant way the problem of eternal conscious torment. So to conclude, those are the two big proposals I see coming through the problem of pain when it comes to the problem of hell and eternal conscious torment in particular. And even though N.T. Wright happens to like this contingent human view, I find it to be a very poor view. And I also honestly don't see much reason to endorse Lewis's other view of hell as being self-imposed, insofar as that is taken in any way to really lessen the blow or the moral or ethical offense that comes with the doctrine of eternal conscious torment.